This brief introduction video to Unit 1 will give you an overview of how it came to pass that Appalachia was described and understood as a unique regional culture in the eastern half of America. And number 2, along the way, I'll underscore a couple parts of your assigned reading that you should pay particular attention to. First lesson this semester. The idea of Appalachia has a history apart from the social fact of Appalachia. How we have described Appalachia and how Appalachia has been defined has really changed dramatically over time. And typically historians have identified 3 major discoveries of Appalachia. Now by discoveries, I don't mean discoveries of the territory or what's in it. By discoveries, I mean the exploration of Appalachia being a unique regional culture within the U.S. Really, before the Civil War, Appalachia was considered to be simply a part of the South, often referred to as simply the Mountain South. But the Civil War set into motion a number of national trends that have prepared the public to accept this idea that Appalachia is this unique, hitherto unknown, in the language of the late 19th century, hitherto unknown region within the eastern half of America. And really the people who pioneered this idea and the people who discovered Appalachia for the first time are generally referred to, this generation of writers, missionaries, and other observers are generally referred to as the local color movement, 1870s to 1910s. Now the local color movement is described very well on page 103 in chapter 10 by David Sung. And do note that he describes one of the local color writers in particular, a woman by the name of Mary Knowles Murphy. And she is a great example of the people who pioneered this idea that Appalachia exists apart from the nation as a unique regional culture. Now, by 1920, the local color movement had pretty much passed and wasn't nearly as popular in 1920. And really those books that Mary Knowles Murphy read were seldom read past 1920. But the idea that they created about Appalachia really persisted. A couple key features about the region that they portrayed that exist and still exist in many ways today, despite the fact that they've been shown to be in many ways false, are number 1, that Appalachia is white. That only white people make up Appalachia, despite the fact we'll see in subsequent units that historians now know that there is a tremendous amount of diversity within the region. Number 2, they described Appalachia as being in America but not of America. That's Appalachia is something other than what America is. And this otherness, this idea that Appalachia is pervaded by otherness has really stuck. Third, they described a region being isolated from the rest of America, isolated both in time and place. The idea goes that the mountains were so impenetrable that there existed a people who had settled there after the American Revolution, who had settled there and had changed very little from the end of the Revolution all the way up to the end of the 19th century. And this simply, again, as we'll see in Unit 2, is not the case. There's a tremendous amount of change going on in the region. However, the local color writers simply didn't acknowledge it, didn't take the time to explore it. Really, their notion about Appalachia remained in place all the way up to the 1960s, when certain aspects of their definition of Appalachia came under question. And really this new period of discovery really hasn't gotten a good label. I would call it post-World War II and the war on poverty. Really came about in the 1960s. This is something we'll take a look at towards the end of the semester. John Alexander Williams, in the introduction to this book, Appalachia, A History, which you'll read on Net Library, gives a brief overview of this. But let me identify a couple things that happened that reawakened the idea of Appalachia in the public's imagination and revived the popularity of Appalachia as a national political, social, cultural issue. Number one of which, of course, is JFK's famous campaign in West Virginia in 1960. He was running for the nomination of the Democratic Party and made West Virginia the central component of his bid for that nomination. And of course, he pledged to West Virginians that and Appalachians totally, that if they were to vote for him and if he would win the presidency, go on to win the nomination and the presidency, he would declare a war on poverty. And as you can imagine, a number of journalists and a number of news camera reporters followed him, recorded this, and this really revived the idea of Appalachia in the national discourse. The culmination of this, and actually he did go on to declare a war on poverty, is the 1965 creation of the Appalachian Regional Commission, something we'll read about, the creation of which we'll read about in the last unit of this semester. But just know for now that in the 1960s the idea was tremendously popular, and the notion about Appalachia came more to be defined by the poverty of the region and how that poverty can be alleviated. One thing this war on poverty did, though, is bring into Appalachia a generation of people who wanted to learn more about the region, wanted to volunteer in the region, serve the region, learn more about the region. They went on to go into the libraries to research about the region and found books that were published in 1910. There was a dearth of scholarly investigation about the region. All this led to the final discovery, one that's ongoing, the contemporary reappraisal of the region that started really in the 1980s and has continued on into the present. The war on poverty, the people who the war on poverty brought into the region went on to earn masters and PhDs in sociology, history, literature. Not only that, but also the widespread availability of higher education within the Appalachian region itself created a generation of scholars who wanted to contest the notions about Appalachia that remained even from as far back as the local color movement. And these people went on to write a tremendous amount of history. And the end product of that are, for example, this book here, High Mountains Rising. Even though the introduction to this book isn't listed as a required reading for the unit, I'd encourage you to go back and take a look at it. And how Richard Straw and Tyler Blethyn, the authors of the book, came to be interested in the region. And really, this generation has not only contested the idea that the local color movement exists, the local color movement gave a false perception, a false definition of the region, but they've also gone on to tackle specifics. And do note that the introduction to High Mountains Rising talks about how all these chapters contest the idea that Appalachia exists even as a monolithic, unique regional culture. The High Mountains Rising really underscores the diversity of the region. They also contest the fact that Appalachia has been isolated. One theme that runs throughout the book is the fact that Appalachia has, in fact, been connected. And finally, they've arrived at a new and better definition of the region, and that's really the core of John Alexander Williams' introduction and his description of postmodern regionalism. And I'll take up that issue in another video, postmodern regionalism.